this segment, we want to share with you how easy it is to use fabric that has been texturized with Texture Magic by Superior Threads to put that fabric into a project that you want to do, be it a pieced project, a paper pieced project, or something that's appliqued. In this particular project, I used fabric and paper pieced the blocks. And sometimes people are scared away by paper piecing because they think it's really difficult. But I have a really easy method for doing it that I think you will love to use, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this project first. This is just a quick and easy little table runner that you can make for the Easter holiday season. And what we did on it was gathered some fat eighths of fabric and used those fabrics to make texturized blocks. Some of the texturized fabric we put into the border, and then the remaining fabric was used for plain strips for the borders. As you can see on some of the blocks, I texturized the fabric by stitching around the design that was on the fabric. On some of the blocks, I added an extra little strip in there, so I got the look of a block that had something extra going on. And on some of them, I added rickrack. So I'll set this aside and I'll show you the fabrics that we're going to work with. So on this particular block that I'm going to make today, I started with a fabric that looks like this. I just stitched right along the lines, then I steamed it to get the texture, and this is what I ended up with. So as you can see, it really turns into a totally different piece of fabric just by adding that texture with the Texture Magic, and it's really simple and easy to do. After I have that done, I'm going to trim my piece so that it fits on the back of the block that I want to paper piece. And I tell you in the pattern exactly what size to make. I'm going to guess that it was about 4.5 by 6.5. All right, so I've got my piece trimmed and ready to go. The next step is to prepare my paper piecing pattern. And I've got the pattern here. This is what the foundation pattern looks like for that particular block. And I'm going to fold this on the seam lines, and I'm going to go all the way around my pattern, folding all of my stitching lines, which on this little egg there are 4 because I'm adding pieces on the top and bottom. That was really simple and easy. Then I'm going to take the fabric that I want to make my egg out of, and I'm going to glue it to the back of my paper. When you're doing paper piecing, this actual pattern is the back of your block. So you always put your fabric on the other side of the paper, the plain side of the paper, with the right side out. And I have found it's easiest to get that to stay where I want it by just putting a little dab of glue from a washable school glue stick on the back. I like to put the glue on the paper, not the fabric, because if you're using regular fabric, you don't want to get that glue in the threads of the fabric because it's harder to get off. With Texture Magic, I don't think it would stick anyway. But I'm just going to position my fabric on there, and because I've got that little bit of glue, it stays in place right where I want it. Okay, I've got my fabric on there. Something I forgot to mention, when I trim my paper pattern, I always leave a little bit of boundary outside that outer dotted line because that's my finished line that I'm going to trim the block to, and it's just easier if I've got a little bit of extra fabric around that. My next step is to trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each one of my seams, and for that the add a quarter ruler makes it really, really simple. There's a special lip built into here. You can just put it right next to it and it's going to hold. So I'm going to fold it back, and I'm just going to take my ruler and butt it up against that. And because it's got this special lip, it stops. It won't go any further, and I've always got an exact 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to trim the extra fabric away, which is simple and easy to do. And now what I'm going to do is something that's a little bit different from typical paper piecing. In normal paper piecing, you would take the piece of fabric that you want to sew onto there, position it on with the right sides together on the fabric side of the block, and then you would turn this and take it to your machine and you would stitch on this line. With this method, instead of stitching on the paper, I'm going to actually fold the paper back again. I'm going to take this to my machine, and I'm going to stitch right next to that line. Normally when you're paper piecing, you put a larger needle in the machine and you adjust your stitch length to a shorter stitch so that the needle and the stitch length pierce the paper and you can pull the paper away when you're done. With this method, you don't need to worry about that because you're not stitching through the paper. So I'm going to set my machine at about a 2 for the stitch length, and then I'm just going to stitch right along, right next to that paper, as close to that paper as I can get without hitting the paper. And I always start stitching off the fabric and finish stitching off the fabric so that I make sure it goes all the way through. And I can pull that out and clip my threads, and then I'm going to press it. Normally when you're doing paper piecing, you don't have the option of which way to press your seam because you've sewn through the paper and the only way you can press is that way. But with this method, your paper is free, so you can choose which way you want to press your seam. And in this instance, I want my seams to go toward the egg because that's going to make that egg really pop up off the surface of my table runner. So I'm going to push the seam this way and I'm going to press it that way. Now remember how we talked about not wanting to touch the Texture Magic with a hot iron? You need to be a little bit careful that you're only pressing on the fabric part. However, I have an iron that has a separate steam generator in it, and it lets me have really good hot steam even on my lowest temperature setting, and I haven't had any trouble. So practice with your iron and see if you're able to touch it. But if you do have an iron that's really hot, just don't touch this part with it. So I'm going to press this seam, and I'm going to add a little steam to make it easier. And I'm just going to push it over that direction. And again, as you can see, I'm mostly just touching the fabric with the tip of my iron. So now I've got that seam pressed, and it's pressed underneath the egg. The other wonderful thing about that is that I don't have any bulk out in here, and when I go to quilt it, my quilting lines I can stitch in the ditch right up next to that. Now I'm going to trim this piece. And for that, I just get my ruler. You're going to take your ruler and align it with the 1/4 inch line right on the dark line of the block. That's your block border. The little dotted line is your outside trimming line. But I usually ignore that line and I just use the dark line. I line my 1/4 inch mark up on there and I just cut and trim as I go. So I'm going to trim that piece off. I'm going to come around here and trim this piece off. And when I'm done, I've got a nice, easy edge there that then I can assemble that block into my project. We've sewn the piece on here and trimmed it, and now I've added the corners on the other 3 sides. So you've got kind of a funny looking block, but that's the beauty of paper piecing. I didn't have to cut these odd shaped triangles that aren't really right triangles and put them on. I could just cut a strip and add it on. Now I've got all 4 corners sewn on. The easy thing about this block is I could do those all at once, and now I can trim it all together. So I've already trimmed this side, but let's do it again to get this bottom corner trimmed. So I'm going to align my 1/4 inch mark right on the dark line of the pattern and trim that off. This gives you a really nice square block when you're finished, or squared up block, and you're ready to add that in your quilt project. The other nice thing about this technique is because you haven't sewn through the paper, normally you have to tear your paper away, you can just pull that pattern away. It's not attached to your block. You've got your block done. That was simple and easy to do, and if you want to use your pattern again for the next block, you can. You don't have to make other copies of it.